Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace News Roundup. This week we bring you an update on the China commercial Earth observation sector, an update as well on a couple of recent conferences taking place in Beijing. But first, we lead off with part 2 of our analysis of the 6th annual China Commercial Aerospace Forum taking place a couple of weeks ago in Wuhan.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
Leading off this week, we will bring you part 2 of the China Commercial Aerospace Forum Roundup. This week, we discuss updates from commercial space companies from the conference a couple of weeks ago. For more updates on CASIC, the host of the conference, check out our news roundup from last week. So, starting off, Jean, would you like to tell us about some updates from iSpace just a couple of weeks ago at the CCAF in Wuhan?
Sure. So, Blaine, as you mentioned, I'll be covering the non-CASIC companies of the conference. The CASIC companies were covered last week. And so, during this conference, the non-CASIC companies, among which we had a lot of private space startups, had the opportunity to present their progress during a number of sub-forums. This was usually 20 to 30-minute keynotes. And as you said, Blaine, some of the interesting ones include iSpace. So, iSpace had a presentation which covered a lot of analysis of launchers around the world, but they also unveiled a lot of interesting things about their roadmap for the years to come. Now, just a little background on iSpace. iSpace is one of the so-called first-generation launch companies in China. So they were founded in 2016, and they were historically one of the more successful launch startups. They were, for example, the first private company to ever put a rocket into orbit. That was last year. And they're currently developing the Hyperbola 1 solid rocket and the Hyperbola 2 reusable liquid rocket. And so the interesting updates they provided was on Hyperbola 2. We know that they've been testing it a lot this year, and next year they revealed that they would be attempting suborbital hops for the Hyperbola 2, which would make the rocket rise up to 100 kilometers and come back to the ground. And this would enable them to verify the entire takeoff and landing sequence, also the throttling of the engine and the ability to control the attitude of the rocket. And if these suborbital hops are successful, then iSpace will move to the full-fledged orbital launch of the Hyperbola 2 in the second half of 2020. And what is also interesting here is to put this into perspective with another company, the company that we considered up to now generally as the most advanced company regarding VTVL technology, vertical takeoff, vertical landing technology, which is the company LinkSpace. So LinkSpace is another of those first generation companies founded in 2014. They've been working on this technology for many years, and last year they succeeded in doing a 300-meter hop with their experimental rocket. And this year they were supposed to partner with another engine manufacturer to integrate their more advanced engine and do a suborbital hop, but that has not happened. I don't know if it's coronavirus or if it's another reason, but we don't have much news from the company, and it's interesting to see that iSpace, a company that initially wasn't developing this technology in the early stages, is catching up with LinkSpace. So that's quite interesting. And just the last point on iSpace that I found interesting was that iSpace also gave us a feel of what they were planning after Hyperbola 2. They showed illustrations of another rocket, a much heavier rocket, which is the Hyperbola 3, a medium lift rocket that would be launched on its own, similar to a Falcon 9, but that could also be associated with 2 or 4 side boosters to increase the payload capacity. And they also showed images of the Jiaodian 2 engine, so it's a much heavier thrust. I think it's a 100-ton thrust on the ground methalox engine that would be used in the Hyperbola 3. And now just a little perspective on this. This is an interesting piece of information because when you look at the 3 most advanced VTVL rocket companies currently in China, you have land space, you have galactic energy, and you have iSpace. And when you look at the rockets of these three companies, so land space, it's the Juche 2 for galactic energy, it's the Pallas 1, and Hyperbola 2 for iSpace, you realize that the payload capacity of Hyperbola 2 is significantly below its competitors. Pallas 1 and Juche 2 are at 4 tons into LEO. Hyperbola 2, however, is at 2 tons. So I feel that iSpace also has this pressure to push out onto the market their medium lift launch vehicle, because I guess we can assume that, you know, the higher the payload capacity, the more economically viable you are in terms of you know, cost per kilogram into space. So that could also be one of the reasons.
Yeah, and I think that was definitely I think that wrapped well into a point that that I believe his name is Huo Jia from iSpace was mentioning during his talk. This idea of, you know, around the world, launchers are getting larger, and there's a lot more economies of scale going on, and so in order to compete, it's important to have a larger rocket, as it were. I think it's interesting that this speech was given at a CASIC conference, because I think if we look at what iSpace is doing, similar to land space and to galactic energy, it is decidedly not what X-Space is doing. And that makes sense, because it seems like X-Space really has that market pretty cornered, of this sort of small, fast response, solid engine rocket that, you know, the Quaito 1A, I think, has launched now 12-ish times successfully. And so when you look at the activities of land space with, you know, really focusing now seemingly more on their Juche 2, although we will find out more in a couple, quite soon with our episode with land space. Looking forward to that. But if you look at that, and also, again, with iSpace, seems like quite a lot more emphasis on the Hyperbola 2 and 3 as opposed to the Hyperbola 1, which is, I guess there's still, you know, it seems like iSpace is putting more effort into the Hyperbola 1 than is land space into the Juche 1, for example. My feeling is that after the initial anomaly on the ZQ1, land space has not done much there. But yeah, I think it's interesting that iSpace is clearly targeting an area where X-Space is not yet really a competitor, and where really CAS does not have a competitive rocket there at the moment either. So I think it goes to show you the kind of adaptability of these companies as it becomes more clear what is and is not going to be fair game for commercial companies, I guess, in these developing industries. I think it's an interesting, it's very Darwinian, I guess. It's and I think to your go ahead.
And I felt that X-Space sort of had to justify themselves regarding this, because they knew that these reusable liquid propulsion rockets were coming after their keynote. So in their keynote, a large part of that was about justifying the business model of small expendable solid rockets. So I found that to be quite interesting. They're aware of the arguments of the competition.
And it is really funny how the ways in which companies like X-Space do need to kind of justify the head start that they, you know, have been given at a minimum in terms of the financial backing from CASIC, and it reckons me back to, I guess, 2 years ago, the CCAF, when I went to that dinner that was hosted by X-Space, and then there were representatives from OneSpace and Landspace and iSpace and all the rocket companies around this big table, and it was an X-Space hosted dinner because they were the host, and I at the end I was kind of like, well, who's paying for all this? And said, oh, X-Space, because they are very rich. I said, well, okay, that's wealth redistribution in a very Chinese aerospace industry kind of way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so anything else on iSpace? Otherwise, I think Tianqi Aerospace was another launch company that had a pretty interesting talk at the CCAF.
Speaking of companies that are going for solid rockets, but also for liquid propulsion, at the same time, you have Tianqi Aerospace, also known as CAS Space. We mentioned them in a previous episode. And so they had a very technical talk about the control theory of launching rockets, of which I probably got less than 10%, but there was also some non-technical discussion where I was able to get some information. And what was interesting in this talk was, among their family of rockets, you have the Tianqi 1, so their first solid rocket that they will put out onto the market. And the Tianqi 1, they announced that the first launch would be in September 2021, and that the payload has also already been selected. It will be a space sciences payload that was built by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So another company that has gotten less visibility, I believe, in the English press in the past is now moving on to launch quite rapidly.
And just 2 points about Zhongke that kind of struck me in the same vein that you mentioned earlier of the technical nature of the talk. So I think that guy's talk, I think they also sped it up to 1.25 times speed. When I was listening to that guy, I'm like, this guy's not actually talking this fast. I think that because I was probably 10-ish% did I understand of that guy's talk, but I don't think it's us. I think they sped that up. The other thing that I think is just interesting to note is that Zhongke, when we think about, so as you mentioned, it's a CAS spinoff, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is a huge, huge organization. And it kind of strikes me as conceivable that they would have such, sufficient launch needs to where they could maybe justify looking into, securing their own launch technology. Basically, I assume that CAS is launching a lot of satellites. Well, I know they're launching a lot of satellites every year. Whether it's justifiable to fund an entire launch company, I just for that sort of internal demand, I don't know. But it certainly helps in terms of securing, anchor clients for Zhongke, as we've seen with the payload that they have secured, which is a CAS payload, as you mentioned. So yeah, with that, I think that's everything from the launch. It was a very launch-heavy conference, but one of the other verticals that we've seen really developing a lot over just the last 1 or 2 years has been Earth observation. A lot of commercial Earth observation companies, a lot of infrastructure that has been built by the government, namely like the Gaofan satellites and other the Gaojing satellites, this kind of constellations. And now we've started to see this infrastructure being utilized in a lot of different ways. And we've seen quite a few different Earth observation companies also building their own infrastructure, that is to say, launching their own constellations. And we've spoken about some of them, but some of them were speaking a couple of weeks ago in Wuhan. So, Jean, were there any Earth observation companies that really stood out to you at the CCAF, or anything in particular that seemed interesting?
Yeah, what I found interesting, first of all, was that there were a lot of EO companies that were providing downstream analytics. You had, just to give a few examples, you had PiSat, you had Chengshun Exploration, you had Zhuhai Orbita, you had Changguang Satellite, you had Vastitude, you had others. And so first point was there was a lot of companies, and second point, and is sort of what you mentioned, is how a lot of these companies that are delivering analytics, they're really striving for the verticalizing the industry, which means that they are striving to have every position in the value chain, from the data acquisition side, the distribution of the data, all the way to the analysis of the data, extracting recommendations from the data, and a lot of them are also providing software and infrastructure. So it's interesting to see this general trend, and I think that another interesting point is to see how all these companies are coming from different backgrounds. So you have companies like PiSat, for example. They really have a background in data analytics, but today we see that they're developing a drone in-house for remote sensing, and they announced a SAR constellation in September. So again, they're over the entire value chain. And on the other hand, you have companies like Changguang or like Zhuhai Orbita that come more from a hardware background. So Changguang is building their own Earth observation satellites, and Zhuhai Orbita, they have a background in hardware. Traditionally, their roots are in the manufacturing of space chips. And these companies are now delivering more and more added value services regarding the analytics that they're actually, the data that they're selling their customers. It's not just selling raw Earth observation imagery. So that was the second point. And another thought that struck me was, with all these companies, they will have to have, I believe, a differentiating factor, because I think there are up to 30 or 40 EO companies today in China. And a question that comes to mind is, what will this differentiating factor be? One could be like a lot of these EO companies, they are using the same data. That's coming from Landsat, that's coming from Sentinel, that's coming from Gaofan, from Fengyun, all these different sources, but they're using the same set of data. There's a select few, as mentioned previously, like Orbita and Changguang and some others that are having their own constellations. So there's a question to what extent this will be a decisive factor in differentiating themselves. And another thing that I've observed was a lot of these companies are also putting forward other types of added value, such as exclusive added value. So an example would be, for example, Vastitude, Dongfang Zhiyuan. This company has been putting forward its very strong specialization in INSAR data, and they put forward that they have a lot of algorithms that are developed in-house and that are really exclusive. You have other companies like Changshan Exploration, and we mentioned a little bit last week. This company that's combining EO and narrowband communications, and so providing this hybrid service to customers. So that's a differentiating factor. And ultimately, I think, and that will be my last point and sort of an open question. I think that the government will probably play a very important role as well as to who will survive and who will thrive and who will just who will develop considerably compared to others. And that is typically, we've heard several companies now during these sub forums mentioning that despite being commercial companies, they realize that today a very large chunk of their business is still coming from government agencies, provinces, and local government agencies more generally.
Yeah, no, lot to unpack there, and definitely a lot going on in EO, to your point. And I think the most interesting thing that I've seen, or one of the more kind of one of the things that stands out, is just as you kind of alluded to, the spectrum of companies that you see. So, for example, PiSat, they had their initial public offering on the star market, the Kechuangban, which is sort of like it's a kind of Chinese wannabe competitor to the NASDAQ, which may one day be a competitor to the NASDAQ. They IPO'd on the Kechuangban, and their market cap is now a little over $1 billion US. And again, they do Earth observation, kind of data analytics systems, and some vertical integration now towards having their own data. But then you see a lot of companies that are more towards the end of the spectrum of having, 20 to 40 employees, and maybe they're very local in their focus. So, for example, I went to Wuhan a couple of years ago to visit a couple of the downstream Earth observation data analytics companies there, and they're basically like set up across from the main university, and there's a lot of EO and sort of like geospatial data type programs at Wuhan University. And so they have a lot of recruiting students from there. The founder of the company was a graduate from there, and I suspect that probably some of their customers would be like the Hubei, Agricultural Bureau or something like this. That they would need this data. It's not like there's anything dodgy going on here, but it's just you're the Hubei local agricultural bureau and you want Earth observation data analytics. You go to what is quite literally your local EO data analytics company that is local. So I think there's definitely the very broad gamut of these companies, and it's getting to be a little bit more muddled, even because the value chain is really, again, you're getting these companies that have, they're manufacturing satellites that are now focusing more on downstream services. And it's becoming an interesting market. So a couple of other points on EO from this week. There was an excellent article written by Funhai Capital talking about the Earth observation sector in China from an investment perspective. And they were talking about the different elements of Earth observation and the idea that relative to other types of or other types of space-based assets, and in particular communication satellites and satellite navigation, this article mentioned that EO on the infrastructure side is relatively less regulated, which is an interesting point insofar as, you have Charming Globe, for example, which is a rather commercial private company, although it's a CAS spinoff. But Charming Globe has their own constellation of Earth observation satellites in orbit now. And the same cannot really be said about any of the commercial constellation companies. Even a company like Space OK, for example, which was a narrowband, is I suppose still, a narrowband constellation company founded in 2014 as a CAS spinoff. Basically the exact same thing as Charming Globe, except they were doing narrowband comms opposed to EO. And whereas Charming Globe has successfully built out this EO constellation of now, I think, 15, 17 satellites, Space OK has not really been able to do that at all. I mean, they have a few satellites in orbit, but they have not really... And if you had looked at their roadmap in, say, 2014, I don't have it in front of me right now, but I would venture to say that by 2020, they would have expected to have a couple dozen satellites. I mean, their whole constellation was quite modest in size, if I recall, is present tense. I think it was something like 28 satellites or 30 something. So it's it's an interesting contrast. And so getting back to this Fanhai Capital article, this idea that Earth observation is less regulated at the infrastructure level than other verticals, I think is a fair point. The author was also mentioning, and I think this was another point to think about, is that now in China there's so much Earth observation data being made available, and also globally, this is not limited to China, that you now have, as Jean, as you were mentioning, this kind of commoditization to some extent. Everyone's using the same data, broadly speaking. And that now you have more opportunity to differentiate based on things like time series. So if you have, if you have the data and you can get all the same data from a specific time series or from a specific spatial resolution or other kind of ways of not just having the data, but having a data series and being able to derive insights from that data series. So definitely a lot going on in the EO sector in China. Last update on the week, I think, from EO sector would be the Yaogan launch that occurred in the early part of last week. And for those who are not familiar, Yaogan is a Earth observation constellation that is primarily military, we think. And the Yaogan satellites, they travel in kind of trios. And there was a really, really excellent article written late last year for, I think, a French aerospace blog that talks about the Yaogan constellation and its potential use for signal intelligence and sort of the speculation behind that. But yeah, so there was a trio of Yaogan satellites launched earlier this week. And as part of that launch, I think there was also a Guodian IoT satellite. So Jean, I believe you had a couple of updates on the IoT satellite, but anything first on the Yaogan launch as well?
Not really. Yaogan is definitely a very hard satellite series to follow because we just don't know much about it. China doesn't reveal a lot of information about it, but thankfully there are a lot of clever observers that have a lot of nice insights by just looking at the orbits, at the launch date, at a lot of these little details that enable us to guess comparatively to other similar constellations on what these satellites are actually doing. So I don't have any additional information, unfortunately. But as you mentioned, there was another satellite that was piggybacking this Long March 2C launch of the Yaogans, and that satellite was the Tianqi 6 satellite. So Tianqi 6 is one of the satellites of the Tianqi constellation that is built by Guodian, so another commercial space company that's building the Tianqi constellation. The Tianqi constellation is a 38 satellite strong IoT narrowband constellation that has been, comparatively to other constellations in China, been deployed at quite a rapid pace. They, for example, over the past 12 to 13 months, they sent six satellites into space in 5 different launches. So that is quite fast to Chinese standards, at least for the past 2-3 years. And it's just interesting to see that we have another IoT constellation that's in the building, as you know, in addition to the CASIC Xingyun IoT constellation that we mentioned last week.
And with that excellent segue, it brings us to our last update of the week, which is a couple of IoT and also 5G, kind of 6G, and other buzz phrases that we all like to hear and then kind of scratch our heads wondering what they actually mean. A couple of conferences related to such buzz phrases. So specifically, we had 2 conferences over the past week that were, I guess, relevant to IoT, and one of them more relevant to satellite. So we had the China Satellite Conference, which is in Beijing. It is the 21st edition of that conference. It is one of the more commercial space conferences in China. And I was not able to attend this year, nor was Jean, but we had a couple of people on the ground that were giving us riveting updates throughout the couple of days. It is not the most significant conference from an announcement perspective, but we did hear a couple of interesting things. We saw some themes. So first, there was a sub-forum on satellite 5G and 6G. And this sub-forum, so, I mean, just the existence of a 6G satellite sub-forum is itself a kind of, it's an overload of buzz phrases, but that's neither here nor there. This forum, however, was largely sponsored, it seemed, by the CETC, so the China Electronics and Technology Corporation, which is in my opinion, an increasingly important SOE to watch in the Chinese space industry. So CETC is roughly similar size to CAS or CASIC. It's about 35-ish billion US dollars per year in top-line revenues, and about 200,000 employees, but with a primary focus on electronic components and other more general electronics technology, but then also a strong emphasis on the sort of ground segment part of the space industry and some of the other network type of elements in the space industry. And admittedly, I do not know as much about CETC as I do about CASIC. However, my feeling is that both companies are state-owned enterprises in industries that are rather price insensitive because it's rather sort of monopolized. And so if they are looking for areas to grow organically, they need to find industries that are commercializing. And one such industry is the space industry. And again, with CASIC, I think a lot of the reason they're going into space is because there are some overlapping competencies with what CASIC does in terms of missiles and other related things. And with CETC, you could imagine a similar thing, although from a somewhat different angle of, a lot of ground equipment type stuff or other kind of general electronics networking. So this CETC-sponsored satellite 5G and 6G sub-forum, a couple of other universities that were speaking at this forum, just some general talk of how to integrate satellite with 5G and 6G. The other IoT and 5G related forum that we saw this week that is of note is the China Industrial IoT and 5G Forum in Wuhan. And this was put together by the MIIT, so the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. And I think the reason that this is worth highlighting in this particular point in time is because with China's 14th five-year plan, which is going to be published quite soon and cover the next 2021 to 2025, industrial IoT is expected to be a major component of this. And there was a really excellent analysis from a sort of a consulting group, I think, called Macro Polo. And their analysis included this idea that over the last several years, Chinese tech innovation has primarily been focused on the consumer internet. And over the next 5 years, a lot of it will be focused on the industrial internet and on this sort of digitization of China's supply chain and this sort of digitization of their industrial base, if you will. And I do think that this industrial IoT trend is going to be something to watch, again, with CASIC, with CETC, and just the space industry in general. So with that all being said, Sean, anything from your side on industrial IoT or 7 or 8G or any other future generations of 5, 6, 7G?
Yeah, that's it's interesting how early China mentions these what seems technologies to be very far from now. I think last year Huawei had a forum as well on 6G and the Internet of Everything, which is supposed to be the next step after the Internet of Things. So yeah, I just wanted to add that I think it's interesting that China is one of those countries that will have a sufficient market demand for all these IoT developments, 5G developments, and because they have the companies such as, to give a few examples, Xiaomi that has a very big smart object, smart home ecosystem that requires IoT. We also have an example that we gave last week. There was CIMC, that's a very large manufacturer of containers, and that is really looking to digitalize the transportation of its containers around the world. And I think that there's been a big push from the central government for smart city technologies among cities in China. So you see a lot of these large cities like Hangzhou, for example, that are investing massively into this technology and actually creating this market demand for the companies that are investing into IoT technology. That didn't come out very well, but
we get the meaning. And the other interesting company to watch in that particular context, I think, and we will end with this, is Ping An with their smart city kind of IoT. I remember last year at the China High Tech Fair in Shenzhen, you were there as well, there was the Ping An smart city booth, and you're walking around this hall, and it's like, it's Huawei, and it's ZTE, and it's all the usual suspects. And then you see Ping An, which, for those who don't know, Ping An is an insurance company. This would be like walking around and seeing Google and Apple and Facebook, and then Prudential Insurance, or some other American life insurance company in the same exhibition hall with their sort of smart city initiative. And so we're definitely going to be seeing a lot of very big, very powerful Chinese companies getting into this IoT and kind of Internet of Everything. And whatever comes after that, it's going to be the Internet of all dimensions and all things. And it's going to be wonderful, I'm sure. We're all going to have a great time. That being said, we're about double the 15 minutes that we had originally hoped for, which means there's a lot to talk about. That's good news. We hope you've enjoyed the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup for the week of October 26th to November 1st. We will see you next week with the News Roundup, and we will see you in a couple of weeks with our special Land Space 1 hour episode on the journey of land space as China's arguably leading commercial launch company. We will have to find a shorter title for the episode, but that's the gist. Thank you for joining us, and have a good rest of your weekend or week.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.